episode with a guest feature. It's not quite a celebrity or a reality star, so for the shallow ones listening, this is a good time to tune out. But if you want to listen to someone with some of the most intelligent views, other than myself, of course, then you've got the right person here. I think my right hand did either go on to become a Nobel Prize winner or one of the most successful morally void banks of our generation. But I'll let him introduce himself. Sam, who are you? What do you study?
I think morally void sounds a bit more like it. I think I'm probably going to be the establishment figure on this one. I don't really see myself as that, but as a 20-year-old student at Durham, which I don't know, I think it's impossible for any institution to distance itself any further from poverty. I mean, you're looking at a place where some of the students live in a castle, so make of that what you will. But a 20-year-old physics student, Durham, pretty much sums up. Nice upbringing in Billericay, hardly poverty, but lots to say.
Yeah, poverty compared to some of the Durham students, though. Not quite that rich.
Oh, yeah.
This week we thought shifting to a more PG topic would be right, but by no means do we want to keep this PC. The hot take this week is the last 10 years of government has made poverty worse. We wanted to keep the context concise and relevant to us, so we decided to break this statement down into 3 areas to see whether relative or absolute poverty has generally got worse. Firstly, we will be discussing the North-South divide, which Sam will be able to give us valuable insight to as he lives in Durham. And we'll also be looking at COVID and poverty. And finally, is relative poverty really a bad thing? Does it serve as a perverse incentive for self-improvement? Right, so starting with the North-South divide. Sam, what's your opinion on the North-South divide as you've lived in Durham for the last 2 years, is it?
Yeah. I mean, it's completely noticeable, especially I've got some family that live in the northeast, and they live in converted mining cottages. So they live in a mining village, and even just hearing what they said about the change in the unemployment rate where they live, bearing in mind that they don't live in the scummiest houses in the northeast or whatever you want to call it. It's not like some headline, but
by a long stretch, no.
No, not at all. But even they were talking about just the level of unemployment that their small village Waldridge had to go through. So it's an interesting one. I mean, there's so much history behind it, especially if you look back to about the 1960s. Yeah. A lot of the recent North-South divide, a lot of people trace back to even little things like the Guardian newspaper, for example, moving its headquarters from Manchester to London. A lot of people saw that kind of move as the start of what we call the modern divide. I think
shift from the north down to the south, like a real movement of the economy from like across the UK down into like a very London centric kind of one.
Yeah, a massive shift in business. I think the 1980s especially is what's led to the divide we have today. I think a mixture of recessions and what people call deindustrialization, or I think if some people want to go a bit further, they call it internal colonization, I think is the word for it.
That's one way to put
it. Where London is now so central that pretty much anywhere else is treated like a colony to London. The key industries of the northeast were mining and shipbuilding, and unfortunately Maggie Thatcher's least favourite business prospects were mining and shipbuilding. So you kind of had this economic shift from industrial-based services to more globalized activities. So you ended up with, in the south, where this shift was happening, lower unemployment. I think in Thatcher's second term, the unemployment of the north grew by 1.1 million, but it fell in the south. So you've got this lower employment and productivity in the north. And I mean, we're talking about 15 of the 1,000 top companies in the UK were based in the north at that point.
Yeah, a lot of them were placed there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the problems, or the real issue now, is that over time it's been almost institutionalized by successive governments, because I mean the ease they have in just blaming it on each other, and the lack of a proper economic plan. I think it owes a lot to the issues behind the title of the podcast.
Yeah.
And it's what's culminated in the situation we have today, where you have, for example, the parliamentary champions of the working class in Labour have been rejected by basically their target market, I mean, when you've got the Northeast voting Tory, I think you're starting to reach the definition of disenfranchised.
Yeah, I think that kind of feeds into like the Brexit debate as well for a lot of people. Like, I was looking at some statistics, and for the North, the Brexit vote was overwhelming. Like, I know in the suburbia, in the
Oh,
southeast,
massive. Especially in places like Sunderland. I mean, you've got the big issue was Brexit. I think it shows a lot more that you've got these people willing to lend their votes to a Tory government in the first place, because there has to be pretty dire straits to put your trust in an organisation that really put you there to begin with.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it just shows an unsurprising lack of faith in Westminster as a whole. I mean, it's not about, especially, you know, I'll talk to my family or whatever up there and so on, and there's evidence to suggest the gap is closing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that things are getting better. And probably the most important stat is productivity, and the difference between worker output in the north and the south is pretty ridiculous. I mean, London obviously is going to be higher than the rest of the country.
Yeah, naturally.
But 26k per head higher in London than in the classic North region.
Extortionate.
So you're getting double the average national wage in London compared to the North East, North West and Yorkshire. So the productivity gap that there was at the turn of the century has doubled up until today. And the difference between the southeast and the northeast, even so, not even in London, if you just go to other
just east of
southern
England,
regions,
even southwest of England as well.
Yeah. Where obviously, you know, we live on a commuter belt in southeast. It's hardly not wealthy.
Yeah, there's some very wealthy people around these ways for sure.
Absolutely, but the gap between the southeast and the northeast is about £10,000 per person.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so even on a regional basis, and you just ignore London, it's a big gap. I mean, there's been big minimum wage increases, so the pay gap is falling. And if you look deeper into London finances, the affordability is so shocking, and average property price is about 3.5 times more than the northeast.
Yeah, when you look at London, it gets even worse when you start looking at the prices of homes in London as well.
Oh no, massively. But I don't think the point to take from that is necessarily that it means that things in the north are cheaper and therefore it's all proportional.
Oh yeah.
Basically, what it shows is that we have a housing crisis and everyone is suffering. I think it seems that the last 20 years that the north-south divide has kind of mirrored where we live, to be honest, in Billericay, because I mean, for those who won't know, Billericay benefits from being on the London commuter belt, and obviously the success and wealth that brings. It's typically wealthier than most of the rest of Basildon Borough, where it's located. For
sure, yeah. Like, I remember the first time I came to Billericay, obviously, like, growing up in Basildon, and like, I don't know, I think I probably would be classed as living in relative poverty. I don't think it anymore, but when I was younger, I remember coming to Billericay, and I had like pretty much, it was a mansion party. It was one of my first parties, and it was 3 of my friends from school. We went to primary school together and went to secondary together, and we was like wow. Like, we'd go around to our friends' houses and we'd be like, where did you buy this table from? How much did it cost? Like, your house is amazing. Like, we honestly looked like peasants walking into their homes. It's just like a complete switch in reality for us, and it really like changed my outlook on life, like in a positive way, I guess. But at the same time, 2 towns less than 3 miles away, the living conditions are the polar opposites, and I guess you could say the same for the southeast, southwest in general, compared to the northeast as well.
Massively. And I think that London and the northeast is a kind of similar situation, where, I mean, you know, there's a difference between run by the same government and run by the same council, but I think actually it's mirrored Billericay and Basildon a lot recently, in the sense that, I mean, post 2008 and the recession and so forth, a lot of the kind of community projects in Billericay have been cancelled. The police force is gone, in the interest of kind of diverting funding to where it's most needed at council level, which is pretty much anywhere else in Basildon Borough. So you get a lot of people that say, well, the gap between Billericay and Basildon's closed in the past 10 years. And it's not necessarily because Basildon's getting better, it's just because Billericay's getting worse. And it's the same thing with the northeast and London. It's not that London necessarily is closing the gap to the northeast because there's all these great community projects in the northeast that are bringing up to the same level. It's just that London's not really having a great time. I think it's probably the best way to put it. It's definitely not
like a kind of both progressing, but one's progressing at a greater rate. It is probably the inverse. And quite interestingly, when I was looking into some of the reports, Since 2010, so obviously when the Tory government obviously kind of took hold of the country, there was a 3.6 billion spending cut, and this is public spending was down 3.6 billion from 2010. I think that was up to 2019 around that time. But in that same time period, public spending in the southeast and the southwest increased by 4.7 billion combined. So it does beg the question. Obviously, George Osborne and his words at the time was obviously about austerity. Well, he didn't use the words austerity, but obviously prudent public finance. Yet seemed it was take from the ones who are already fairly worse off and then give to the richer. I thought another staggering statistic as well was I was looking at so as we were speaking earlier, the manufacturing and production centres of this country. What really brought this country success in the world was from the north and the northeast and northwest. But Cambridge as a town has as many R&D jobs, research and development jobs, as the north in general. And just put that into population, the Cambridge population is 285,000, whereas the north is 15 million, and they have the same amount of jobs in R&D. So, to me, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, you go to Cambridge and you look at these recent developments like the Cavendish Centre and so on, all these open plan places where even as well in like Warwick and so on in the south, where you've got like Jaguar and so on building their new R&D departments in the southern unis, and I just can't see anything like that in the north. I think that there's a lot of nice talk from successive governments about building nice things in the north, and I think one of the main things was transport links and so on. They're trying to build that up as well. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of it is just nice words.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down
there's
to.
just not been that much evidence that they're trying to improve things in the north rather than just show that the gap's closing. And I think, unfortunately, just since there isn't that much money about, you're just reducing the quality pretty much everywhere, rather than improving it somewhere and maybe reducing it in another place.
I think for me, it just comes down to there's a whole lot of rhetoric around the area. And I think we should be keen to point out as well that we're not obviously just going to blame the last 10 years of Tory government. As you said on your opening talk about it, this is something which has been going on by successive governments. Obviously, it was kind of started, the ball kind of began rolling with Maggie Thatcher, the milk snatcher, but by the time it gets to Tony Blair, a man who's kind of trying to represent Britain at large, he once again fails to address some of the larger problems in our country, which is the north-south divide. And I think then you kind of bring that onto the present day 2016 Brexit vote. I think this large disenfranchisement by these kind of communities where they've had funding cut for years is then we've had enough of the Westminster elite and the South in general. I remember actually a really poignant story. I don't know if I've told you this before actually. I was, this is last year, I'd literally just finished university for the year, and obviously my university is only a 5-minute walk away really from Westminster Abbey. So I thought, you know what, Brexit's going on, all the kind of protests around that. I thought I'll go down there, I'll have a little look. And there was 2 blokes from Manchester who came down, pissed out their heads, absolutely pissed out their heads. And they looked at Westminster, and they were behind me, I wasn't talking to them at this moment, and they looked at Westminster and I was like, so this is where all the fucking decisions get made. And I looked down at them and I smiled and went, yep, they make decisions for all of us. And they kind of then went on a rant about how they felt their communities have been left behind by like the Westminster elite. And it kind of really kind of hit me, because it kind of made me understand like how we live such different lives, being in the same country, and how their perspective of governance was so different. And I think it's something which kind of it's probably been manifested in them from their parents, and how they kind of feel like they've been left behind. So as you said with Margaret Thatcher, I think the right thing for the country was deindustrialisation. It was more the fact that there was nothing there then put to kind of incentivise companies to invest or for government jobs to be put there. It was kind of just left as is and told, yeah, you can just kind of do it yourself kind of thing. I think it's left a lot of resentment for people in the region in general, but I think obviously you'd be able to speak more on that, like kind of how your family may feel about how they've kind of been left behind, or if they have been left behind at all.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it feeds into something which we were talking about, which is quite interesting, about saying like, does it act as any motivation for people? And I think for this particular example, like you just have to say no. I think there's obviously going to be some that following deindustrialisation saw kind of how the financial powerhouse of the UK was changing, and they would have benefited off it by moving down south or coming up with some new startup and so on. But I think it only served to sow distrust in the majority, and I think realistically, it won't have influenced the attitude of many people beyond the voting pattern. I mean, there's a reason the North has been more of a Labour stronghold for so long, and I think the latest election simply shows how little belief there is anymore in the powers that be to cause lasting and effective change. It's almost a perfect example of how the opposite attitude occurs of just a genuinely unfair scenario and people believing whoever's in charge doesn't have their best interest at heart. So why would it motivate you? I mean, I challenge anyone to go to Sunderland and ask people if the closure of the shipyards was motivation for them.
Motivation to change their lives.
Because you're not going to have a friendly discussion. You're going to get a smack in the mouth. I mean, even beyond that, just even the quality of life effects are so shocking. I mean, excess death in adults, for example, which is, accidents at work, alcohol, suicide, drugs, is higher for both men and women in the North, and particularly for those in their early 40s, so in a pretty prime working age.
Working age for sure.
And as a figure really to show the difference, since the beginning of what you might call the modern divide in 1965, about 1.2 million more people have died before the age of 75 in the North than the South. So the decisions that have been made in the past 40, 50 years are pretty lethal ones from both governments. Excess deaths for people in the North compared to the South.
Yeah, it's just staggering numbers. I think like one of the other things I was looking at as well was for poverty numbers. So I don't know when the start of this statistic is, but it was around 200,000 more children are now in poverty in the northeast, and I think the northwest as well as a general rule. And I think this is actually a really good time to kind of mention, obviously, did you see Keir Starmer's face-off with Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's Questions about 3 weeks ago? Yeah, so for anyone who's listening, which I'm sure there'll be a lot of you, I'll put this in the video on YouTube so you can obviously refer to it. But it was
a report last week from the government's Social Mobility Commission concluded that there are now 600,000 more children living in relative poverty than in 2012. The report went on to say child poverty rates are projected to increase to 5.2 million by 2022. What does the Prime Minister think caused that?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for what he said about dexamethasone, and I'm glad that he's finally paying tribute to the efforts of this country in tackling coronavirus. But I can tell him that on free school meals, this government is very proud that we set up universal free school meals, and I'm very pleased that we are going to be able to deliver a COVID summer food package to some of the poorest families in this country, and that's exactly the right thing to do. But I must say that I think he's completely wrong in what he says about poverty. Absolute poverty, relative poverty have both declined under this government, and there are hundreds of thousands, I think 400,000 fewer families living in poverty now than there were in 2010.
It seemed like such a great back and forth between them, because Keir Starmer obviously addresses the fact that obviously we have COVID going on at the moment, and there's a lot of kind of council and public sectors which are really going under a lot of stress. So in this time, child poverty is increasing, and then instead of kind of addressing the problem, Boris's response to it is actually no, it's not. And then they obviously have a week later, he kind of comes back to him, and the Child Commission has even agreed with him and said that there's a problem. And I think obviously Keir Starmer was referencing it on like a large scale kind of point of view, but in the North it's so much worse. And I think I was looking at a stat as well, and it was like jobs paying less than the living wage is increased by 10.9%. And for those who obviously anyone can affix any number to the living wage. Living wage is mentioned to be £9, and for reference, I do a part-time job at Tesco, and I get paid about £9, I think 50 or something like that. And I'm only a part-time worker, so there's a 10.9% increase in people in the North who are earning less than that. Like, I just can't see how that's acceptable, and how it's actually fair that people in the same country as me doing a similar job could actually be being paid less to live. Yeah,
and I mean, I think the Westminster target was to have child poverty pretty much eradicated from the UK by this year.
I think that was a target. So yeah.
Yeah, so you can see how policy has made a success of that. Obviously, it's completely evident that there's no child poverty in the UK at all. Another chance to show how Westminster has benefited us all and come up with a brilliant solution. I'm not a big advocate for having devolved government. I think a lot of people would use it pretty badly, but I think in this case there's more than in most other cases where people are probably calling for it, because I think, as I say, it is just disenfranchisement at this point, that neither Labour nor Conservatives, who realistically are the only two people or only two parties that are ever going to take charge of the country, I think just the North now doesn't believe that they have their best interests at heart.
Yeah, and that's a kind of a dangerous and volatile political environment to walk into, and I think it kind of speaks to, obviously, if you look 2 weeks back about obviously my mention of the Black Lives Matter and things like that. I think that's when you start really getting inflamed tensions between groups, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of groups in this country and parts of society that have been left behind and forgotten. It's not just one section of society. So I think that's why you get a lot of people kind of annoyed by certain protests when they feel actually you're quite privileged to live where you are and you should feel luckier. I thought another interesting thing is obviously Boris's slogan, or one of his sound bites of many for the recent election, was we're going to level up the country. sounds very similar to the George Osborne speak of the Northern Powerhouse, which is lagging slightly. I was looking at it's called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, so they look into a lot of poverty statistics as well themselves, and they found out of all the regions, the lowest earning regions were the ones which needed obviously the most levelling up to say. However, in a time period between 2015 up until now, so mainly Theresa May, the North East has seen the largest rise in poverty, and I believe that's relative poverty, of 2.2%. It just all seems so paradoxical to me. Like, it seems that you hear all this rhetoric and sound bites coming out of governments, and it's just not just the last 10 years, even though that's what we're focusing on, and they've definitely done that themselves too. But it seems like they're saying, we're going to help you, we're going to make this Northern Powerhouse, we're going to make the North great again. Yet the North still only represents 19% of the UK economy, and living conditions are getting worse simultaneously. And I don't want to be too cynical, but at the end of the day, 10 years is a long time to make a dent in that problem. It's not going to be fixed, but you can make a dent in it. And then you have the Institute for Public Policy Research, who they were given the task of overseeing the Northern Powerhouse project. They've themselves put out videos on their YouTube, and I'll put those in as well, and you'll be able to see it now.
Good evening, thanks for joining us. First tonight, 10 years ago today, the government announced huge spending cuts following the financial crisis. Welfare, councils and police budgets were all reduced. Tonight, a decade on, we look at the impact of austerity. A new report claims the cuts have left the North less resilient to deal with coronavirus. But the Chancellor has told Look North councils are getting government support, and he's still committed to levelling up the economy. We'll hear from Rishi Sunak in just a moment, and from people who say they've been badly hit by the cuts. First, though, here's our political editor, James Vincent.
Everyone will share in the rewards when we succeed. When we say we're all in this together, we mean it.
The word austerity wasn't actually in George Osborne's budget speech that day, but it came to define a decade of tightening purse strings and protests. Barnsley Council's seen spending cuts of 40% in a decade. 4 out of 10 council jobs are gone.
I think it's been an act of neglect. I genuinely think it's been an act of national self-harm. I think it is a legacy of untold misery for the North. And whilst I completely understand that governments have to be prudent with the public finances, what austerity did was choke off growth, and it devastated communities because of a lack of opportunity and investment. So I think it was a flawed economic policy, and I very much hope that the current government will learn the lessons of it.
In the last 10 years, council spending has been cut across the country. For the whole of England, it's fallen by 13%. But for the North, that figure is 20%. That's a fall of £346 per person.
10 years of austerity has really reduced the resilience of the North of England to respond, resilience of our local councils to respond. And yet they are still out there doing a fantastic job day on day, trying to tackle social care challenges and all of the issues that have come along with COVID-19.
Town halls across the north are looking behind that wood panelling for spare cash. Extra spending on the pandemic and an unexpected loss of income is pushing them close to going bust.
It's a huge strain, and we can't say anything other than that. We reckon at North Yorkshire County Council, and we now reckon it's more like £75 million. Now, we have had some government support, and I'm very grateful for that. That government support is about £25 million, and that's very helpful, but it isn't, quite clearly, it's not going to cover the full cost.
West Yorkshire should have a mayor by next year, new power and more money to spend up here. Could devolution, a Conservative policy that grew out of austerity and the Northern Powerhouse, be the answer to how the North recovers?
Devolution gives us hope for the future, but what devolution is not, it's not a salvation for the cuts that local authorities have already had to withstand over the last 10 years. That devolution money will not pay for children's social care, it will not pay for adult social care, it won't pay for your bins collecting.
The word austerity doesn't really get used much anymore. Levelling up is what you'll hear from the mouths of ministers. But what if the last decade has made that job even harder? James Vincent, BBC Look North.
So what effect has austerity had on children and young people growing up in some of our inner city areas? Our social affairs correspondent Emma Glasby has been talking to people in Bradford.
A sandwich, a bun and yoghurt and some fruit.
Lunches for school children and hot meals for families on the Buttershaw estate in Bradford.
The price of food seems to be creeping up gradually, doesn't it? And these are a lifeline.
Outside Sandell Community Centre, food is left out, so people...
is where they're blaming austerity for lagging the ability of the Northern Powerhouse project. And I think they said they need at least £70 billion kind of blueprint to kind of make it work and actually help the North East and the North West and obviously Yorkshire and Humber as well. So it seems like there's a massive divergence between words and action here, and it's saddening, really.
Yeah, I mean, £70 billion is a lot for them to try and find down the back of the sofa at this point, and I think
for sure, yeah.
They've probably realised that now that if they'd invested that maybe 10 years ago, the amount will be a lot less. I mean, you have a look at even, again, I'm going to draw some parallels with where we live, in terms of the housing crisis and how the cost of that has risen over even the past 5 years, where, you know, I think they were saying in Billericay there would need to be something like 3,000 new houses built just before 2010, and they were talking about, you know, to fix the affordable housing crisis, and that's now up to about 16,000, I think, in Billericay.
The number's always rising.
Where there's just been no investment into it, and even if they do try and build these new houses, there's no idea for how to build the infrastructure around it, where it's going to go, and so on. And I think it's a similar thing now, that amount would have been so much lower 10 years ago, and just a lack of investment has meant that it's just going to keep rising and rising until something gets done. And the problem is, because it keeps rising, nothing ever does get done.
Yeah, it does take a ridiculous amount of time for governments to act. So I will obviously point out as well that when I was kind of looking at kind of the Conservatives' pledges, because obviously they're the government that we're looking at now, Boris did pledge £4.2 billion over 5 years for northern infrastructure, and that being the key thing when we say infrastructure. Right now, I'm kind of focusing on poverty, which is a really big. Transport is a really big indicator for alleviating poverty and improving opportunities and so on, and social mobility, all those kind of things which are big factors in helping people out of poverty. But my problem then, and obviously this is before coronavirus, so even before this kind of pandemic arose, it would be staggered over 5 years, so it'd work out at something like, I think 750 million per year, and also councils would be bidding against each other. And when we're kind of trying to get people to work together, you're just telling them to kind of be competitive against one another and say, well, you have to bid for this amount, you have to bid for this amount. And I think they did actually set up they set up the Transport for the North initiative, and it's called the Strategic Transport Plan. They set up 19 local authorities to work together. So for me, why is this money not being pulled into this, where they're all going to have an equal voice and be able to discuss, okay, how can we connect to our regions, rather than, okay, each council has to bid for this money, do their own projects in kind of situ and isolation from one another. And it's not how it's worked. Like, obviously you see the HS1 projects and HS2, they all start in the south, why is there no grand kind of transport project or multiple transport projects to help the whole north as a region, like be able to travel from Newcastle to Liverpool, rather than we have to go from London to Birmingham to Manchester, then to Liverpool, and then find a weird way across the Pennines to then get to Newcastle. I think you can speak of your experiences as well, especially on Northern Rail, and how I remember you saying about how poor the line was.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever got a train from the north that's been on time. I half the time they're cancelled. I think I read a little while back about my family live near Chesterley Street, which is about halfway between Durham and Newcastle. And obviously a lot of the people there rely on their commuter belt into Newcastle, and most of the people there work in Newcastle. And they were talking about the fact that that most of them get the train in, and there hadn't been a train working on that line for 2 weeks at one time. I think this was late 2018. 2 weeks in a row where basically people haven't been able to get the train into work at peak times.
So imagine the uproar if that was in the southeast. Whenever there is problems like that in the southeast, you hear it all over the press.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been absolutely everywhere. And I remember when I was looking at the time, and it was one guy standing up the Chesterley Street MP, and about 4 people had turned up to talk about the situation in the northeast with the trains. So, I mean, yeah, it's not the best experience. I've had a 3.5 hour delay. I think the last time I got a train there.
And as like a comparison, obviously for those who know me, but obviously for those who don't, I have to commute into London for university, and I could swear by my right hand that I've probably only had in my 2 years of commuting on a regular basis about 3 or 4 delays on my line. Like, I rarely have a delay, and obviously my train line is so confident of that I can get a refund if my train's a minute late. And honestly, I mean, in that whole time, I've had barely any delays. If they are delays, they're so negligible. I'm just like, yeah, whatever, like, it's fine. But that just shows a difference. I think the epitome of it was, you're talking about a Tory government who are all about kind of privatisation. I'm not trying to say NHS or anything like that, but just in general, they believe facilities work better in the private hand because it's more efficient, which obviously is logic to. But the epitome of it was the renationalisation of Northern Rail. And you think like, really, what is going on here? Like, and I think for most of us in the southeast, and most of us people listening will be from the southeast, and probably haven't really experienced living in the northeast like you have. It's like a different world, and I think we've kind of drawn that quite clearly between obviously your anecdotal experience of living there and just the numbers, the pure numbers of it just show that like there's a different level of care for if you live in the southeast or London or the southwest. But if you live in the northeast and northwest or Yorkshire and Humber, it's just different.
Yeah, massively. And I mean, it really does surprise me because of the amount of money that the government could make out of just trying to invest in this. Because, I mean, for example, the line that I'm talking about where I'm delayed on is the main line between Newcastle and London. So most of the people that are on those delayed trains that I'm on are coming from business meetings in Newcastle and going back to London. So we're talking about a lot of wealthy people and a lot of wealthy business that is potentially missing out on running as efficiently as it can.
Yeah.
Basically, just because there's just no investment.
Yeah, it is poor to see, really. Like, you would think that by now things would have improved from obviously the reforms that did occur in the 70s and 80s, but they haven't. I thought, like, lastly, kind of finishing on like the north-south divide. I looked at some statistics on homelessness and emergency food parcels. So when I was looking at emergency food parcels, I kind of aggregated the numbers together for the northwest and northeast and Yorkshire and Humber. So the overall population of the north, you could say, which is those 3 regions put together, is 15.3 million. And for the southeast, the east of London and the east of England and London, the population overall is 24 million. So I'm going to tell you the number of food parcels for the southeast, east of England and London, totals at 471,000. Have a guess at how many it is for 10 million less people in the north.
I wouldn't even want to guess.
So
I wouldn't.
For 10 million less near enough people in the north, there's 401,000 emergency food parcels. This is by the Trussell Trust, which is a very large, I think it's pretty much a group of food banks, and they kind of aggregate information from different food banks and their own. So a 10 million population difference only translates to a 70,000 difference in food parcels. And I know a lot of people who have been very poor, lived in poverty, had alcoholic parents, and not many of them have ever really been driven to kind of emergency food parcels. But it seems like in the north, there's definitely a larger problem with this, and people, and I think that kind of speaks to the statistic I used earlier about so many more people on less than living wage, and obviously having to use these facilities, and it's only really going to get worse throughout the pandemic.
Definitely.
Do you want to move on to COVID and poverty, or do you want to, Carrot, do you have another thing to say on this?
No, I'm happy to move on to COVID.
All right, go on, you can open the gambit, boy.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really get more current than this. You can actually draw probably some similarity with the previous topic, and it's just another example of some demographics in the past few months have just been launched into poverty basically out of their control. And the shocking thing on this subject has been the fact that it's exposed such a soft underbelly to social security in the UK.
Definitely.
And how close many people are to slipping below the poverty line. I mean, what I found really interesting looking at this was food-related issues. So I kind of took it as a literal breadline. And I'm looking at kind of, I suppose, food issues, they're one of the largest poverty indicators because the knock-on effects are so profound. I mean, lower life expectancy, weaker immune systems. I mean, trying to think of more poor mental health.
Yeah.
And I mean, proven educational outcome and ending up with stable employment are all related to how you're eating. And the past couple of months has really exposed the problem with distribution of food and actually getting people the food that they need, and a whole demographic is suffering because of it. I mean, it's no great secret that since 2010 social security has been cut massively. In fact, £30 billion worth for working age people.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah. And particularly adults with young children are taking the hit. I mean, the UK imports about half of its food, so it's got very delicate supply chains, and COVID has effectively tested the system to its maximum. And I mean, you were talking about trussels, the number of food parcels that they've distributed, even before COVID. So just looking at the kind of level that people are on as opposed to 2010, I mean, it was 26 times as high. So 26 times more food parcels in 2019 than in 2010. So a year before the crisis even began, the Food Standards Agency was estimating that about 10.2 million people in the UK were food insecure.
Wait, you said 10.2 million?
Yeah. Food insecure. So people that, they had enough to eat, but if anything was going to go wrong, they wouldn't have enough to eat. And going into obviously this crisis, there's been key issues of, at the start, stockpiling, panic buying. I mean, stockpiling is still an issue. And the result that you unfortunately have is the families with lower incomes that can't afford high-end products that are left because everyone buys, your Co-op home brand and stockpiles it. So you're just left with, Dutchy Original on the shelves, and low-income families can't afford to live on that kind of diet. And it disrupts kind of low-income shopping habits as well, like looking for deals in different shops, being really clever about how you're eating, to the point that the Food Foundation found that 14% of households at the moment are skipping meals, and you've got 6% of households where you've got people going entire days without eating a meal.
Yeah, it's not right.
No, and it's true that there's some extra social security in place to deal with it. I mean, you've got £20 per week extra in your universal credit at the moment. But
how much is £20 really in the grand scheme of things? Obviously, it's helpful.
No, exactly.
How effective?
Especially, as I say, it's helpful if you're able to really be strategic about what you were buying and so on, but you can't, because you go into a shop and probably what you're left with as your options are things which are going to cost you 20 pence more on average anyway.
Yeah.
So the £20 extra per week isn't going to
help much.
Do that much for you.
No,
yeah, exactly.
And
I think
as well, obviously you mentioned about, is it a 30? Did you say 35 or 30 billion cut in social spending?
Yep.
Yeah, so I was looking at...
That's just for working age
had,
people as well.
We had obviously a big movement last 2 years towards universal credits, so kind of streamlining social service payments, which I was always personally against. I've seen my mother struggle with trying to get out of the benefits trap, you could say, for like a long time, and the emotional effects for anyone who hasn't gone through it is like it's hard to see. It's hard for anyone of any age, and I feel like I've been quite lucky to kind of get through it on the brighter side. But I do work for a lot of people as well at Tesco part-time who can't take more hours, literally because universal credit and the social service system before says no. And the reason why it says no, this is the maths behind it. So if you're on tax credits, or if you're just on universal credit now in general, for every extra pound you earn, 63p is deducted. That's just disproportionate. Like, mathematically, that's disproportionate. And you can tell me whether that makes sense mathematically to do that, but that means
no,
for every...
I can tell you right now it doesn't.
Yeah, so for every extra pound you earn, you're earning 37p out of that. How high is that? So you talk about people saying, oh, they want to tax you out the arse, they want to take all your money off you. Yet, our social services, and our social service net, takes more money off of people for working and trying to alleviate themselves out of poverty and take themselves off universal credit or any form of benefits. And I don't know, it honestly just scrambles my brain. Like, I honestly do not understand how, because obviously the conservative way of thinking for me, and obviously from the way I've kind of listened to them speak, and I'm talking more about not just people support conservatives, but actually membership of the party, MPs, is that work overall will set you free, which kind of reminds me of Arbeitsmarktfrei, which is obviously the Nazi saying of work will set you free, where in the opposite, it doesn't set you free, it changes you to the ground, and it keeps you in a situation you are. And that's obviously why we have that kind of a benefit trap. That's what it is. Like, there's no other way of describing it. I obviously have people at work tell me I can't take more hours. I want to, but I can't because my benefits will be cut and I won't be able to afford to live, pay for electricity, gas and so forth, and then clothe my children. So we definitely have a problem, and I think it's only now going to get worse that we have a global pandemic. I don't see how this...
I mean, I don't think that universal credit was the answer to this crisis anyway. You've got such wide-scale redundancies. I think the reports were on the queues for universal credit applications, because obviously you couldn't go into talk to anyone. Trying to do it over the phone was taking too long, so they were directing people online, and the queue to apply was over 100,000 long. So for people trying to get their £20 extra a week, they were having to wait ages. Because of just basically the lack of efficiency in the system. So universal credit really wasn't the answer, to be honest, and it does seem like a bit of a cop-out. And I think in general, effectively what's happened is the social security system in the UK has just been laid bare and shown that it can't function beyond the absolute norm. I mean, moving on to just in general the effects. I mean, 7 million households who lost significant income due to COVID in the UK. So that's about 25% of households in the UK. And 2.2 million have suffered one of their top two earners being made redundant or losing all of their self-employed income.
Yeah.
So you can see how many people were going to end up heading towards this system or trying to gain something extra from this system to make up for the situation at the moment, and it was just impossible. There's no, they couldn't.
I think
the queues were too long.
Another big problem for me as well was the fact that when the kind of government obviously had the scheme for like furloughed workers and things like that to kind of give people like an extra amount of money, and I think really, I must say, it's very rare for me to kind of ever kind of celebrate a decision by the Tories, if you know me, but I think Rishi Sunak did do a brilliant job overall. I think he was really put in a difficult situation. His first kind of senior tenure in a position in the government, he done quite well, but the sad fact of it is it hasn't protected the most vulnerable in our society. And I was looking at a report by the Standard Life Foundation, and this is their CEO's statement about it. The job protection measures brought in by the Chancellor were far-reaching and helped millions, but those on the lowest pay and most likely with the least resources to fall back on appear to have been the least protected. And even in his person, obviously it's his job to look into these kind of disparities in society, and he's already saying that we haven't protected the most vulnerable in our society. And I think when you then look at like 0-hour contracts as well, there's nothing there. You can't be put on a furlough on a 0-hour contract. It doesn't work. There's no way that can function. So I think it has exposed a lot of things about our economy, which personally I felt I was aware of, and I'm sure a lot of people kind of were critiques of, but it's ruthlessly exposed them now, and in the worst way possible, which no one wants to see, whether it's to be right or wrong. No one wants to see people suffering at this kind of level.
Yeah, and I don't think that either of us are really saying there's too much that any government can really do when you've got such an unprecedented situation, and a kind of the level of financial support for 7 million households, that many households, is pretty much unviable. But I think what has happened is that COVID has really exposed any damage to, as I say, for example, social security from the past 10 years. So realistically, all of the fallout that's going to come from this, I think the level above what you'd expect can be attributed to, as I say, cuts from the last 10 years.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very true. I think one of the sadder things as well, obviously taking away the monetary value and all the kind of statistics away from it, is I was looking at, I think it's poverty.ac.uk. Their research is by Bristol University, so obviously very good university, and they found that 50% of households believe they'll struggle to fulfil their financial commitments, and half of households are already anxious about their financial commitments in the future. So like, you obviously now, I feel like this kind of speaks to what I was talking about last week as well. You could easily now kind of walk into a mental health crisis of adults. Like, obviously we're aware that men under 40 and when around that kind of age are obviously some of the worst exposed to the risk of suicide, but this could just make it worse. This situation could make it worse. I mean, I don't want to beat the government down too much because he is coming across like that for sure. But there definitely needs to kind of be some action into this. And when you kind of have Boris Johnson, who really just blubbers and spatters most of the time, he's doing PMQs, and he doesn't really answer the questions. At this time, we really need someone to be frank and honest about the situation and assess it. At the end of the day, he's only in his first year, and not even a year now, of being Prime Minister, so no one's expecting to change the world, but it's as if his attitude doesn't even want to address some of the problems his predecessors have left for him. And I think that's what's more worrying for me, is the fact that there seems to be a slight arrogance amongst him and his cabinet about fixing some of the problems and helping the poorest in our society. I watched a video as well before we've done this about the hidden homeless in the country as well, and how none of these people, because they're in like shelters or shared homes, none of these people could work because they couldn't social distance, and it kind of makes their plight even worse. And it's, I think as well, where's the statistic? It was 64% of people in serious financial difficulty are renting. Yet, when the government came out with all their policies to help people, they kind of focused on people on mortgages first. Which, when a lot of the country is renting, and especially in London, a lot of people are renting, and these kind of statistics coming out saying these are people most vulnerable, people who are renting their homes, you need to look after them first. The government's first action was the inverse, look after people on mortgages. And I don't know, it just seems paradoxical, their way of dealing with the pandemic, and I feel there's a lot of ways it could have been improved, and I think we're definitely going to see a fallout in the year to come.
Yeah, unfortunately. I think maybe beyond even a year. I think I honestly think you'd be a brave man to try and make predictions about how long this is going to carry on for, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's affecting policy for the next government, and maybe even the government beyond that.
Yeah, I think just kind of to finish up on this kind of area, I think the thing that worries me the most is despite all the good work that Rishi Sunak's done, and I think in a time of need, we've probably had one of the better chancellors over the last 10-20 years is in him. The sad thing is, obviously, he's now kind of, it seems that there's no certainty in his words, but it seems like he's kind of setting a roadmap to kind of say there's going to be people need some like kind of financial prudence going into the future. And at a time when we realise, and the ECB at this point actually supports that public debt can go up to about 110%, and it doesn't mean I'm advocating it, but it means we have that kind of leeway to help people. Would cutting finances when the virus is ending, kind of quotations, would that be a smart idea, or would it just kind of make the problem worse? And I think these are all questions which will ultimately be answered in the future, but I think it's a very treacherous kind of way to be going. I think possibly this is a time to kind of go back to the Keynesian economics of the 1940s and see how we emerge from a crisis beforehand, and see if those same kind of techniques can help us and help the poorest in our society.
Yeah, definitely.
Finally then, is poverty a perverse incentive? And I think we should actually probably make it clearer now. I probably should have made it clearer earlier. Absolute poverty and relative poverty. So absolute poverty means you cannot afford the bare essentials of life, so shelter, food, clothing, all those type of things. Whereas relative poverty, I think, is always a hard one to kind of put your finger on. where its actual definition is that you earn 50% less than the median income of the country. So it's a very odd way of describing it, but yeah, that's kind of its actual technical definition. But we're going to focus on obviously relative poverty. Sam, do you think relative poverty can act as an incentive or not?
Age-old question. I think maybe, but I think the problem with it is that there will never be a government in charge long enough to test it, and different parties have different ideas on how to tackle the issue. Obviously, the whole thing of being beat down by the rich man is never going to be something that motivates you to do better. But then, obviously, I think everyone has within them that whole thing of trying to better themselves. So, I think it would be dangerous to say that no one has any motivation from the situation they're in if they're in a bad situation, because I think everyone does. I think it's just people's ideas on whether they think that it's worth acting on it or not, and if there's anywhere really for them to go. I think if you look at it, the two main methods of challenging poverty in policy are work incentive and social security, and pretty much they're oxymoronic. I mean, they basically challenge the validity of the other.
Yeah, sure they do.
The benefits undermines the idea of getting a work incentive, and then trying to push large employment schemes undermines people's view and tolerance of the benefit system. And unfortunately, it has very different effects on different demographics. I mean, JRF did a study over about 25 years from 1980 onwards, looking at directly at how government policy affects households and to what extent they, might look to change or are able to change their own position financially, and concluded that, unsurprisingly, single-parent families have the lowest work incentive and are also the poorest demographic, with childcare taken into account.
Yeah.
Which is unsurprising, since a lot of single parents will rightly say it's a full-time job.
Yeah, for sure.
And the problem is that since, for example, since that study was conducted, child benefit has been capped at, I think, 2 children.
Yeah, it has been.
So you can see how, like, with just using that as an example, you get some families end up in positions where they can be reliant on social security put in place by one government, and then another government cuts it and tells them to go to work. I think if you're in one of the poorest demographics, it's not going to motivate you to see different governments doing that. It's just going to confuse you, or it's just going to leave you in limbo, effectively. I mean, work incentives, so, trying to give people employment schemes and so on, rose mostly over that study in the same years that poverty and inequality did. But that's not to say that policy is, the sole reason for that. There's a lot of complicated reasons.
Yeah, correlation, not causation, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Different people will respond to reforms in different ways, and it might just be certain things going on at different times. But I think it's an indicator that if you have a low income or little means to, better your position, it's really not as simple as just giving people some money or employment bonuses and saying that's going to motivate them, they're going to do better for themselves. There has to be a bridge there that people genuinely can see how they're going to be able to change their position.
Yeah, for sure. It is a very complex problem. As you're saying, it's a web of things overall which kind of come into, obviously, policy incentives, and obviously then your environment as well. What's your access to a good school? Like, do you have the role models there available to you to look at and think, I want to be like my peer inspires me, and they may come from a nicer background from you, and then obviously they set a better kind of model for you to kind of base yourself off of. And I think obviously for me, I have a different experience obviously from yourself. Obviously, there's no way I'd have been able to go to Mayflower. Like, obviously my mum had to like scrape money out of her purse to get me to school, like, on weekdays, and that's not even an exaggeration. I mean, I'd be taking the last pounds out of my mum's purse for me to get to school, and there's no chance without my grandparents I'd be where I am today. But in the same breath, I think I was always told from a very young age that if you really want to achieve something, if you really want to do it, you can do it. If you have to put your mind to it and achieve it, and it's obviously a massive cliche, and it's very hard to actually do it and put it into action. But I think then my access to Bidariki and going to Mayflower at the time, I then obviously had a lot of role models around me. I may not have had access to tutoring and things, but I had a lot of people around me, especially like yourself, who were far more intelligent than me. Well, you were. I'm definitely smarter now, mate. But
I don't know if that's still true. Yeah.
But obviously, I had people like you around me, and I had other people, and obviously they know exactly who they are, who I looked at, and I'm just competitive in nature. And for me, it was like, if they can do it, and if they can do it to a high level, why can't I? And I didn't see my situation and my home situation at the time as a reason for me not to go for that. Definitely, it was a hindrance. Definitely, it may have stopped me from maybe going to that next level and being a student like you are at Durham. But at the end of the day, it was definitely an incentive for me at some level to think, I don't want to bring a family into the level of life I've had. I don't want to be in that kind of situation. So it is an interesting one. But once again, I think it kind of speaks to like the north-south divide as well, kind of bring it back to what we were saying earlier. I may have lived in Basildon, which isn't the nicest area, and anyone who's lived in the area can admit that themselves. But Billericay is next to me. Stock is next to me. There's some really nice areas right next to me. So I had that access to education at the end of the day to kind of help alleviate myself out of my situation. But once again, there's obviously other factors. Not all people have access to grandparents who are going to be really helpful. Like, they've supported myself and my mother and my siblings my whole life. Can I say that about everyone else? And the matter of the fact is, no. I've grown up with those people and seen them take completely different roads than me, and a lot of it has ended badly at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think for me, probably what sums it up is that if you look at kind of the experiences that we had in school, it's almost a miracle that I am where I am, because my work ethic is terrible. You know, in general, I probably did as much as I possibly could to try and throw away the kind of opportunities I've been given, and still came out of it obviously doing pretty well.
Shows your natural ability.
So I think mainly what it shows is that I was lucky that even, you know, a completely normal comprehensive school, even just being in the area that I was, that they ended up with the kind of staff that would try and push you, and, you know, genuinely were at that kind of level that they wouldn't let you fail, and they you know, they all had your best interest at heart and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And obviously that's come entirely from where I've lived my entire life, even though it was a comprehensive school. And obviously most people won't have, or a lot of people won't have, the same opportunity just from effectively where they've been born. That no matter what they really do, you've got a pretty good guarantee that you're going to end up in a decent position.
Yeah, it does kind of come down to, I think, kind of like just luck of the raffle, really, in the day of like who you're born with and things like that. And I think we've both been exceptionally lucky. Obviously, for those that don't know, me and Sam shared a classroom with each other. What? How many hours a week did we spend together, Sam?
Enough. Some would say too many.
Yeah, enough. And I think that was a really big like changing point in my life, kind of being surrounded by you and the rest of the boys. And it was a male-dominated class. In all honesty, it was always boys. For everyone listening, it was literally just boys in our triple science class. And all these boys, I mean, for everyone listening, they're all exceptional. Sam's exceptional, and the rest of them are. I can't gauge their intelligence, and when they explain these very complex things to me, and they kind of break down certain kind of theories to me so I can understand them, and they've helped me a long way. And at the end of the day, this was a class of about 20 of these boys who were all exceptional what they'd done at all different levels, and they all had very different personalities, and it was just a brilliant place for me to be able to bounce off of. And at the end of the day, I think everyone has that innate sense of wanting to learn and understand concepts, but sometimes that can be stifled by your peer groups. And I was lucky enough to have you boys around me to kind of help me grow as a person, and realise actually I would like to go to university, actually I would like to kind of take academia a bit further, and have people to speak, like literally as we are now, speak about these issues and be able to kind of dissect them and understand them and kind of listen to other people's opinions. And if you don't have that environment, and you're unlucky enough to not be born in that kind of environment or have access to that, then, you know, for me, poverty and being in relative poverty, I'd say, was kind of like a big driver for me to work even harder and really try and aspire to be like you guys. But what about the kid who doesn't have that? And for me, that's the sad thing about it. And I don't think there's enough being done currently to help those kind of people. And when you have Marcus Rashford coming out and helping the government do a U-turn on their policies,
I think the fact that Marcus Rashford had to get involved is unbelievable. But no, exactly. I've always thought that personally, I know how well I work has nothing to do with where I am and what I'm doing. It's about the people that are surrounding you while you're doing it. And I think, unfortunately, there's going to be too many places in the UK at the moment where it's incredibly hard to motivate yourself if there's no one else trying to push you to do it. And I mean, I know that sounds pretty kind of dark, that it's almost impossible to just motivate yourself to do something. But I think everyone's going to agree that yeah, as you say, it's not an easy thing. You do need that support network around you, and especially in a lot of boroughs in London and so on, it's just there aren't enough people around you. I mean, obviously, not casting any aspersions on anyone. It's just the whole thing of being surrounded by enough people who will give you that support, not just in terms of your friends and so on, but you actually need that from, for example, the youth groups and so on in London, and the youth centres that most of them have been closed down now, and those kind of community projects. And I think a lot of people will even talk about that in Billericay now, about the number of those that have been cancelled in the last 10 years, and I think it's probably had a direct correlation with a raise in the crime rate.
Yeah, for sure. I think we could definitely see a deterioration of people only a few years younger than us and their behaviour. Like, I've honestly heard some ridiculous stories of like knives being pulled out of Lake Meadows by like 15-year-olds, and I'm thinking, like, I wasn't a good kid. You know what I was like? I used to mess about. I'd act all like, I wouldn't say hard, but I messed about. I joked about, but for no moment in any of that kind of arguments I used to get with people, and those kind of heated debates, and even times where people may be racist to me, or I may have been racist to them, or whatever kind of occurred, at no point would I then think, like, I'm going to pull out a knife on someone. And I don't know if it's obviously a factor of the culture, music, and I'm not blaming music, but obviously it is a factor, or if it's just a kind of like lack of role models that people have now. But this is only like a 2-3 year gap. This is not generational, and we're already seeing in Billericay youths walking around with knives and thinking they're bad. Like, and I'm thinking, like, these are people who are lucky, who do have good role models around them, and parents with good jobs for the most part. Obviously, we can't accentuate for people's home lives, but by and large, these are people in fairly like nice kind of surroundings. So if they're kind of resorting to this behaviour and getting themselves in trouble with the law, what can you say about other areas in the country? And I think it kind of does kind of come down to, it comes down to a lot of factors, whether kind of being in a worse situation is going to incentivise you to work harder, or if it's going to kind of be the complete opposite and lead you down a dark path. And to finish, I think it's kind of best we answer the hot take is, has poverty got worse in the last 10 years? Sam, I'll let you answer whether you think it's got worse or not.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me the main thing looking at that was, for example, social security, and the fact that we've now got a housing crisis and a care home crisis and so on. Like, everything's in crisis. And I think, obviously, it's a difficult position for the government over the last 10 years to inherit in 2010. But I think it would be impossible to try and say that things have got better. So I think realistically the only way you can go there is to say that things have got worse. As I say, looking at the North as an example, and just how much COVID has exposed the situation that we have in the UK at the moment, and the fact that 3 months of economic uncertainty could mean that we're talking about changes in policy for the next 8 to 10 years, shows like the soft underbelly that social security and so on has in the UK. And I think as a result you can only say that people are going to be more exposed to poverty.
Yeah, I think just to be blunt about it, I think our beliefs as of why are probably different, and our experience is different. But for me, despite my personal situation over the last few years definitely improving, and there was a point in my life where I didn't know if I'd have a roof over my head in a month or so, and that is honestly straight facts. Honestly, that is what my kind of life was at one point during school. I think, although my personal situation has improved, as I've like grown up, I'm aware of a lot of people who are really struggling, and things have got worse for them. And I hear it from my mum, and obviously the people that she's grown up with, and the kind of situations they're in. And obviously I look at the numbers, the statistics, the general anger and resentment in society by so many groups against one another. And obviously that's not just down to poverty, there's a lot of things to do with that as well. But I just think, just for kind of aggregating all my experiences and my mother's experiences, my family's, and even yours with kind of being in Durham the last 2 years of your life, it just kind of makes you think that things have only really got worse in the country as a general rule of thumb. And I'm not just going to blame the Tories, even though they are definitely going to take a large amount of that blame. it kind of has been successive governments which have failed to really attack at the heart of the problems in our society, which has been, as we've said, ruthlessly exposed by COVID for sure.
Yeah.
Right, we'll leave it there, 'cause I think we've definitely chewed everyone's ears off. It was probably, we said, what, half an hour, 45 minutes, and it's been an hour.
Yeah, it's gone a little bit over.
And it's 8 minutes until the last Premier League game, so right, we definitely need to go. But thank you for anyone that's been listening the whole time. I hope it's been a different type of format to be listening to. This was actually really fun, to be honest. I actually really enjoyed having you on, Sam, so hopefully I'll have you on more, and I'm sure everyone else would like to have you on more. But yes, thank you, everyone. We should hopefully be back in a week or two. Sam, any final words?
No, other than, I don't know, I'm just looking forward to seeing Arsenal get smacked by Watford.
I'm hoping Tottenham lose, but